Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're tackling a topic that might make some people uncomfortable, but it's something that's so important to talk about openly and honestly, especially in the context of faith. We're diving into the often hushed conversation about intimacy in Christian marriage.
It's interesting you say hushed, because that's exactly what the podcast episode Unashamed and Unafraid wants to address. They argue that all the silence around intimacy can actually do more harm than good.
Yeah, it's like this taboo topic, right?
Okay.
Even though the Christian faith sees marriage and intimacy as sacred.
Exactly. And when we don't talk openly about it, it can create a lot of confusion and misconceptions.
It makes you wonder how many couples out there are struggling in silence, feeling like they can't ask questions or seek guidance.
That's a really good point. And that's why Unashamed and Unafraid takes this bold stance to break down those walls of silence and encourage honest dialogue.
So how do they approach this topic? What's the foundation for their arguments?
Well, they go right back to the source. The Bible,
I knew you were going to say that.
of course. They look at the verse in Matthew 19.5. You know that one? And the two shall become one flesh.
Yeah, we hear that one a lot at weddings.
Right, it's a beautiful image. But this podcast dives deeper. It's not just a nice-sounding phrase. It describes this incredible union that's about so much more than just the physical act.
So there's more to it than meets the eye.
Exactly. They talk about this intertwining of the physical, emotional, and spiritual. Imagine these three strands woven together to create this unbreakable bond.
Wow, that's powerful.
And this understanding changes things. Because if becoming one flesh encompasses all of that, then desiring your spouse isn't just some basic instinct. It's a natural and beautiful part of that deep connection God intended.
So they're saying it's okay to actually desire your spouse and not feel guilty about it.
That's a big shift from how intimacy is sometimes portrayed even within Christian circles.
For sure, sometimes it feels like we're supposed to feel ashamed of those desires.
Right, but this podcast is all about flipping that script and celebrating that God-given connection.
And that leads into the next point they make about intimacy being a gift, not a duty. They even use the word gift to describe it.
I love that it totally changes the whole feeling. And they back it up with scripture, too. They talk about 1 Corinthians 7:3-4, which mentions not withholding yourselves from one another. But they emphasize that this isn't about obligation, but mutual fulfillment and joy.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here. Instead of approaching intimacy with a sense of duty or guilt, we should be viewing it as this beautiful gift we get to share with our spouse.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can transform how couples experience intimacy.
But life gets busy, routines get stale. How do we actually keep that spark alive over time?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? How do you keep things fresh and exciting when the honeymoon phase is over?
Well, the good news is it doesn't have to be about those big romantic gestures or trying to recreate those early sparks. It's more about being intentional and finding those little ways to connect with each other on a daily basis.
So what are some of those little things that can make a big difference? Well, remember those three strands we were talking about? Physical, emotional, spiritual. The advice from Unashamed and Unafraid touches on all of them. For example, they talk about the importance of making time for each other, even when life gets hectic.
I think that's a big one. It's so easy to let date night slip away when you're juggling work, kids, all the things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even if it's just a simple date night at home, cooking dinner together, or watching a movie after the kids are in bed, it shows your partner that you're prioritizing your relationship.
And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Sometimes just putting your phones away and truly being present with each other can be more meaningful than some expensive night out.
Totally agree. It's quality over quantity. And then there's the emotional side of things. Unashamed and Unafraid stresses the importance of understanding each other's love languages. You know, those different ways we give and receive love.
Oh yeah, we've talked about love languages before. It's amazing how much of a difference it can make.
Right, because what feels loving to you might not land the same way with your partner. So maybe your love language is acts of service and you're always doing things around the house. But your partner's love language is words of affirmation. And they're craving those verbal expressions of love.
Yeah, if you're not speaking the same language, it's like you're talking past each other.
Totally.
Yeah.
And both of you end up feeling unappreciated.
So how can we apply this to intimacy?
Well, the podcast encourages couples to figure out each other's love languages and make a conscious effort to express love in those ways. It's about paying attention to the details that make your partner feel seen and cherished.
And those small gestures can really add up. Leaving a note for your partner, bringing them their favorite coffee, just taking the time to listen attentively after a tough day.
It's all about those daily deposits of love and affection. And what I find really interesting is how the podcast ties all of this back to the spiritual dimension of marriage.
Oh, tell me more about that.
They suggest that these intentional acts of love are a reflection of God's love for us. It's like mirroring that unconditional love and grace within the marriage.
So it's not just about keeping the romance alive, it's about reflecting something deeper.
Exactly. And when you approach intimacy with that in mind, it becomes less about the physical act itself and more about nurturing that connection with your partner and with God.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. But let's be real, not all marriages are perfect. Couples go through tough times, communication breakdowns, and sometimes that spark just seems to fade. What does Unashamed and Unafraid say to those couples who are struggling?
Well, they remind us that intimacy goes beyond just the physical. It's
Yeah.
about those three strands we keep coming back to: physical, emotional, and spiritual.
So if you're having trouble in your intimate life, the first step is to take a look at the foundation of your relationship.
You got it. Because if there's a lack of communication or trust has been broken, or if you've drifted apart spiritually, focusing solely on the physical is like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
Yeah, it's not going to address the root of the problem.
Exactly. So it's about taking a holistic approach, looking at all the different aspects of your relationship and seeing what needs attention.
And for some couples, that might involve seeking help from outside sources.
Absolutely. And Unashamed and Unafraid really emphasizes that point. They encourage couples to reach out for support, whether it's from a pastor, a Christian counselor, someone who can offer guidance.
And there's still such a stigma around therapy sometimes, especially in religious communities.
It's true, but the podcast does a great job of normalizing it. They say seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness.
It's about realizing you don't have to go through this alone.
And even if you're not facing major challenges, I think we can all benefit from having those people in our lives, those trusted voices who offer support and encouragement.
Absolutely, we all need that.
And the podcast even suggests that seeking help can be a form of spiritual growth.
How so?
It's about humility, acknowledging that you don't have all the answers, and being open to receiving wisdom from others.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together. And I'm curious about something. What about those who aren't necessarily Christian? Do these insights still apply?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll explore as we wrap up this deep dive in part 3. Stay tuned.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive on intimacy, and we've been focusing on this Christian podcast, Unashamed and Unafraid. But what about those who aren't necessarily following that faith? Do these principles still hold up?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it speaks to how universal a lot of these ideas are.
Yeah.
Even though the podcast comes from a Christian perspective, there's a lot there that anyone can connect with, especially when it comes to building strong and healthy relationships.
So it's not just about religion. It's about something deeper.
Right. It's about those basic human needs for connection and love and wanting to feel close to someone.
And those needs are universal.
Absolutely.
Well,
Think about the emphasis on communication. That's essential in any relationship, isn't it?
for sure, whether it's romantic or with family or friends, being able to talk openly and honestly is key.
Right. And not just talking, but
Yeah.
really listening and understanding each other's perspectives.
That's so important. And what about the focus on those small acts of love?
Oh, yeah. That's huge.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always about the grand gestures. It's about those little things that show your partner you care.
Like what kind of things?
Well, we talked about love languages. Speaking your partner's language, making time for each other, just showing appreciation in those little ways.
It's those everyday moments that can really make a difference.
Exactly. And I think the idea of seeking support when you need it, that's something everyone can benefit from.
Yeah, sometimes we try to handle everything ourselves, but having that network of support can be so crucial.
Whether it's a therapist, a counselor, a friend, a mentor, it's okay to ask for help.
It's a sign of strength, actually.
Exactly. And it shows that you're committed to growth.
So even though this podcast we've been discussing is geared towards Christian couples, there's a lot of wisdom there that applies to all of us.
I agree. At the end of the day, we're all just trying to navigate this thing called love.
And these insights can help us do that in a more intentional and fulfilling way.
Remember that phrase, ignite the sunshine inside?
Yeah, that's such a great image.
It's about cultivating that inner joy and warmth and letting it radiate outwards into our relationships.
It's about bringing that sunshine to every aspect of our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave you with a question. What are some small steps you can take to bring more sunshine to your own relationships?
What are those little acts of love you can sprinkle into your interactions? How can you create more space for connection and communication?
Remember, building strong relationships takes effort, but the rewards are so worth it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
Until next time.